The sound of bare feet slapping against wet concrete echoes through the narrow streets of Ouagadougou. In the heart of Burkina Faso's bustling capital, a story is about to unfold that will shake the foundations of a nation. This is not just another tale of military intervention or political upheaval. This is the story of how one small, starving child became the catalyst for a revolution that would transform an entire country. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had no idea that following a 7-year-old boy through the marketplace would lead him to challenge the most powerful people in his nation. He couldn't have known that a single act of curiosity would expose a web of corruption so vast and so cruel that it would demand nothing less than complete revolution to correct. Before we dive into this remarkable true story, I want you to think about this. What would you do if you discovered that your own government was stealing food from starving children? How far would you go to protect the innocent when the system itself is the predator? Keep those questions in mind as we follow Captain Traoré on a journey that began with compassion and ended with courage that changed history itself. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Ouagadougou's central marketplace, casting long shadows between the colorful stalls where vendors hawked everything from vibrant fabrics to fresh vegetables. Captain Ibrahim Traoré adjusted his military beret and wiped the sweat from his brow as he began his routine patrol through the city's most crowded district. At 28 years old, Ibrahim had been walking these same streets for 3 years, maintaining order and keeping watch over the bustling heart of Burkina Faso's capital. But this particular morning felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made the hair on Ibrahim's arms stand on end. For weeks, dangerous whispers had been circulating through the capital like poison in the water supply. Street vendors spoke in hushed tones about international aid shipments that mysteriously vanished before reaching their intended destinations. Market women exchanged knowing glances when discussing government programs that existed only on paper while children continued to starve in the streets. Ibrahim had always prided himself on being observant, a skill honed through years of military training and street patrols. He knew how to read a crowd, how to spot trouble before it erupted, how to sense when something was wrong even before he could identify exactly what it was. Today, every instinct he possessed was screaming that something significant was about to happen. As he walked past the familiar chaos of morning commerce, the calls of fruit sellers, the haggling between customers and vendors, the rumble of motorcycles weaving through pedestrian traffic, Ibrahim's trained eyes swept continuously across the sea of faces. He was looking for pickpockets, troublemakers, anyone who might disturb the fragile peace of the marketplace. What he found instead would change his life forever. Moving through the crowd with desperate urgency was a small boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Ibrahim had seen thousands of street children during his years of patrol, but something about this particular child immediately captured his attention. The boy was painfully thin, his ribs clearly visible through a torn shirt that hung on his skeletal frame like fabric on a scarecrow. His bare feet were cracked and bleeding from the hot pavement, and his hair was matted with dust and grime that spoke of nights spent sleeping rough in the unforgiving streets. But it wasn't the boy's poverty that made Ibrahim stop and stare. It was his incredible sense of purpose and determination. While other street children sat motionlessly on corners with empty bowls, begging listlessly for spare change, this boy moved with focused intensity that seemed completely out of place for someone so young. His dark eyes, far too old and wise for such a young face, scanned every person in the crowd with desperate hope mixed with growing desperation. Ibrahim watched in fascination as the boy approached. A wealthy woman draped in expensive traditional fabrics. Her arms were loaded with shopping bags from the city's most exclusive boutiques, and gold jewelry caught the sunlight as she moved, clearly advertising her status to everyone around her. The small boy's tiny hand reached out to gently touch her flowing dress, and he whispered something urgent in her ear. His voice barely audible above the cacophony of the marketplace. The woman's reaction was immediate and brutal. She recoiled as if the child had physically contaminated her, her face contorting with disgust and horror. With vicious force, she pushed the boy away, sending his small body stumbling backward. Ibrahim tensed, ready to intervene if the child fell or was injured. But what happened next surprised him completely. The boy didn't cry out in pain or collapse in defeat. Instead, he straightened his thin shoulders with remarkable dignity, brushed the dust from his torn clothes with careful precision, and immediately approached the next person walking by. Then the next, and the next after that, always whispering the same urgent words with unwavering determination that defied his obvious exhaustion and hunger. Ibrahim's curiosity overwhelmed his professional caution, and he began moving closer through the crowd, straining to hear exactly what the child was saying to each person he approached. The marketplace was loud and chaotic, filled with the sounds of haggling vendors, honking motorcycles, bleating goats, and chattering customers conducting the daily business of urban life. But Ibrahim focused all his attention on the boy's whispered pleas, using the enhanced hearing skills his military training had developed. Finally, he caught it clearly. Words spoken in the local Mooré language that Ibrahim had grown up speaking in his own village outside the capital. The boy was not asking for money for himself. He was not begging for food to fill his own obviously empty stomach. Instead, he kept repeating the same heartbreaking phrase over and over again. "Please, my sister needs food. She hasn't eaten in 3 days. Please help my little sister. She's dying and I don't know what else to do." The raw desperation in those simple words, mixed with fierce protective love, struck Ibrahim like a physical blow to his chest. The emotion awakened powerful memories from his own childhood in a small, forgotten village where his mother had worked 3 exhausting jobs just to put a single meal on their table each day. He remembered the constant worry in her eyes, the way she would give him her own portion when supplies ran low, always claiming she wasn't hungry even though he could hear her stomach growling in the darkness of their one-room home. But there was something else about this boy. Something that made Ibrahim's well-trained military instincts sharpen to high alert. The child carried himself with an unusual maturity and awareness that seemed completely out of place for someone so young. His eyes didn't just scan the crowd for potential help, they watched for potential danger. He moved with the careful, calculated steps of someone who had learned to survive in a hostile world, someone who had seen things no child should ever have to witness. Ibrahim was so absorbed in studying the boy that he almost missed the moment everything changed. The child suddenly froze in the middle of the busy square, his entire small body going rigid with unmistakable terror. His dark eyes had spotted something or someone across the crowded marketplace that filled him with absolute horror and panic. Without any warning whatsoever, the boy turned and began running as fast as his undernourished legs could carry him, clutching something tightly to his chest that Ibrahim had not noticed before. The way the boy protected that bundle, cradling it against his body, like his very life depended on keeping it safe, sent alarm bells ringing, loudly in Ibrahim's experienced military. Ibrahim made a split-second decision that would alter the course of his entire life. Abandoning his planned patrol route, he began following the running boy, maintaining a careful distance to avoid being spotted while keeping visual contact through the maze of narrow streets and crowded alleyways. His military training kicked in automatically as he moved through the shadows of the urban landscape, using doorways and market stalls as cover while tracking his target through the concrete jungle of Ouagadougou. The boy moved with surprising speed and agility despite his obvious weakness from chronic malnutrition. He seemed to know every shortcut, every hidden passage, every escape route through the city's most neglected neighborhoods. Ibrahim found himself impressed by the child's street navigation skills, even as he struggled to keep up without revealing his presence. As they moved deeper into the city's forgotten areas, the stark contrast with the wealthy shopping district became increasingly shocking and heartbreaking. The bustling, cheerful sounds of the main marketplace gradually faded behind them, replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional cry of a baby or the distant argument between neighbors living too close together in impossible conditions. Here, in Ouagadougou's most impoverished section, hope itself seemed to have died long ago. Corrugated metal sheets and scraps of plastic served as walls for countless makeshift homes that barely qualified as shelters for human beings. Open sewers ran between the ramshackle structures, filling the air with a stench so overpowering that Ibrahim had to cover his nose and mouth with his uniform sleeve to continue breathing. Children dressed in rags played in pools of muddy water mixed with garbage, their laughter a defiant sound of innocent joy in the midst of overwhelming poverty and despair. Women balanced impossibly heavy loads on their heads as they navigated the narrow paths between dwellings, their faces etched with the permanent exhaustion of people fighting a losing battle against circumstances beyond their control. Ibrahim, who had grown up poor himself, was still shocked by the conditions he witnessed. He had known intellectually that such poverty existed in his country, but seeing it up close, smelling it, feeling it press against him from all sides, was an entirely different experience. This was not the romantic poverty sometimes portrayed in movies or charity advertisements. This was grinding, dehumanizing destitution that stripped people of dignity and hope with systematic cruelty. The boy he was following kept glancing over his shoulder, his young face etched with lines of fear that no child should ever have to wear. It became increasingly clear that he was not just running from something specific, he was protecting something precious, and that protection was driving him forward, despite his obvious exhaustion and mounting terror. After what felt like an eternity of twisting through the urban maze, dodging hanging laundry and stepping carefully around open cooking fires, the boy finally disappeared into what appeared to be a completely abandoned building. The structure looked ready to collapse at any moment, with walls made of rusty metal sheets held together by wire, prayer, and sheer stubborn refusal to fall down. Ibrahim waited several tense minutes in the shadows of a nearby dwelling, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his service weapon while he observed the area for any signs of danger, ambush, or hostile activity. The military had taught him patience, but also caution. Situations that seemed simple often proved to be far more complex and dangerous than they initially appeared. When he was confident that the immediate area was relatively safe, Ibrahim carefully approached the ramshackle building and peered through a small gap in the metal sheeting that served as the main door. What he saw inside made his breath catch in his throat and his heart stop, beating for several long seconds. Inside the cramped space, which was barely larger than a small closet and certainly not fit for human habitation, the boy was carefully unwrapping the mysterious bundle he had been protecting so fiercely throughout their desperate flight through the slums. Ibrahim's trained eyes strained to see clearly in the dim light that filtered through holes in the makeshift metal roof. What he discovered made his blood run cold with shock and horror that penetrated to his very soul. The bundle was not food or stolen goods, as one might have expected from a street child. It was not treasure or contraband or anything that could be sold for money to buy necessities. It was a baby. A tiny, fragile infant who couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 months old. The child had the same intelligent, dark eyes as the boy who had been caring for her, and she was clearly malnourished, her tiny limbs frighteningly thin and delicate. But she was alive, alert, and looking up at her young protector with complete trust and unconditional love. But that shocking discovery was not what made Ibrahim's world tilt dangerously on its axis and threaten to collapse entirely. What truly made his blood freeze in his veins was the sight of 2 other children huddled in the darkest corner of the makeshift shelter, barely visible in the shadows but unmistakably present. A girl who appeared to be about 5 years old sat holding another baby, this one even smaller and weaker than the first. Her large eyes held the same premature wisdom and caution that Ibrahim had noticed in the boy, the look of someone who had been forced to grow up far too quickly in a world that offered no mercy to the innocent. All 4 children were clearly suffering from severe malnutrition. Their clothes were nothing more than dirty rags that hung loosely on their skeletal frames, their eyes hollow with hunger and chronic exhaustion. The smell of unwashed bodies and human waste was overwhelming in the confined space. Speaking of days or weeks without access to basic sanitation or hygiene facilities, the terrible truth crashed over Ibrahim like a devastating tsunami that swept away every assumption he had made about the situation. The boy he had been following was not just caring for one sister, as he had claimed in his desperate pleas for help throughout the marketplace. He was the sole protector and provider for 3 other human beings, 3 babies and small children who were completely dependent on his ability to find food, water, and shelter in a world that had abandoned them as thoroughly as if they had never been born. A 7-year-old child had somehow taken on the impossible responsibility of keeping 3 innocent lives alive in conditions that would challenge and potentially defeat a grown adult with resources and experience. The magnitude of what this small boy was attempting defied belief and comprehension. Ibrahim watched in stunned, horrified silence as the boy, whose name he still didn't know, carefully examined his meager collection of food with the concentration of a surgeon planning a life-saving operation. He had managed to acquire a single piece of stale bread, probably discarded by a bakery at the end of the day when day-old goods were thrown away rather than given to the hungry. There was also one small, bruised piece of fruit that looked like it had been retrieved from someone's garbage, spotted with age and beginning to rot, but still containing precious nutrients. With the precision of a trained medical professional and the love of the most devoted parent, the boy divided these pathetic scraps into tiny portions, giving the largest pieces to the babies who needed the most nutrition and keeping nothing but the smallest crumbs for himself. The love, sacrifice, and mathematical precision displayed in that simple act brought tears streaming down Ibrahim's weathered face and ignited a burning flame of righteous anger in his chest that threatened to consume him completely. The injustice of the situation was so overwhelming, so fundamentally wrong and evil, that Ibrahim felt his entire worldview shifting and cracking under the weight of this revelation. How could this possibly be happening in his beloved country? How could innocent children be left to survive like wild animals in the streets while government officials lived in air-conditioned mansions, drove expensive cars imported from Europe, and sent their own children to prestigious schools in France and Switzerland? Ibrahim had been hearing whispers and rumors about missing aid money for months now. Street vendors and market women had been telling increasingly frequent stories about international food supplies that mysteriously disappeared from government warehouses before they could reach the starving populations they were meant to save. There had been talk of aid programs that existed only on paper, while the money intended for implementation vanished into private bank accounts. But seeing the brutal reality up close, watching a 7-year-old boy carry the impossible weight of 3 precious lives on his impossibly small shoulders, transformed those distant whispers and abstract concerns into a roar of injustice that filled Ibrahim's mind with white-hot fury and an unshakable determination to take action. The boy suddenly looked up from his careful distribution of food, his finely tuned survival instincts alerting him that he was being watched by someone outside his sanctuary. His dark eyes met Ibrahim's through the gap in the metal sheeting, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, time stood completely still. But the child's expression was not one of fear, shame, or guilt, as Ibrahim might have expected from someone caught in such vulnerable circumstances. Instead, it was an expression of quiet, unshakable dignity, the look of a soul that had been aged far beyond its years by responsibility and hardship, but had never been. Broken by despair or defeat, Ibrahim slowly and carefully pushed aside the metal sheet that served as a door and stepped into the cramped shelter, moving with deliberate gentleness to avoid frightening the children who had already endured far too much trauma in their short lives. The boy immediately moved to shield the babies, his thin arms spreading wide in a gesture of protection that would have been heroic if it were not so absolutely heartbreaking to witness. Even in his own desperate situation, facing a uniformed soldier who could represent any number of threats or dangers, the boy's first instinct was to protect those who depended on him. The courage and selflessness displayed in that automatic response spoke volumes about his character and the depth of his commitment to his makeshift family. "I'm not here to hurt you or your family," Ibrahim said softly in fluent Moray, crouching down slowly to bring himself to the boy's eye level and appear less threatening. "What is your name, little brother?" The boy's chin lifted with stubborn pride that would have made a king jealous. Despite his rags, his obvious hunger, and his impossible circumstances, he carried himself with the dignity of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. There was no shame in his bearing, no apology for his condition, only the quiet strength of someone who had faced the worst the world could offer and refused to be broken by it. "My name is Amadou," he said clearly, his voice stronger than his physical condition would suggest possible. "These are my sisters. They are my family and my responsibility. I take care of them because no one else will. No one else cares what happens to children like us." The simple statement carried such profound truth and heartbreaking acceptance that Ibrahim felt his chest tighten with emotion. This child had already learned lessons about responsibility and sacrifice that many adults never master in their entire lives. "Where are your parents, Amadou? What happened to bring you and your sisters to this place?" Ibrahim asked gently, though he suspected the answer would be difficult to hear. For just a moment, the boy's carefully maintained composure cracked like a dam under too much pressure. Pain flashed across his young features, and Ibrahim caught a glimpse of the frightened, traumatized child hiding beneath the protective shell of premature adulthood that circumstances had forced him to develop. "They are gone forever," Amadou said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The soldiers came to our village exactly 2 years ago. There was terrible fighting that lasted for days and nights. I could hear the guns and explosions, and people were screaming and running everywhere." He paused, gathering strength to continue the painful story. "My mother grabbed me and my sisters and told us to run as fast as we could and never look back. She said she would find us later when the fighting stopped and it was safe to return home." His voice trailed off into silence, but his meaning was crystal clear to Ibrahim. His mother never came. She never could come. The fighting had taken her, along with countless other innocent people who had been caught in conflicts they never chose and wars they never wanted. The violence had orphaned these children and left them to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them through neglect and indifference. Ibrahim felt his heart breaking into 1,000 pieces, and his resolve hardening into unbreakable steel at exactly the same time. This boy, this absolutely incredible child who had somehow managed to keep 3 babies alive for 2 full years in conditions that would defeat most adults, represented everything that was fundamentally wrong with his country and everything that was fundamentally right with the human spirit. Amadou was living proof that love and determination could triumph over impossible odds when given even the smallest chance to flourish. But he was also living evidence of a system that had failed its most vulnerable citizens in the most catastrophic and inexcusable way possible. "Amadou," Ibrahim said carefully, "I want to help you and your sisters in any way that I can. Will you let me try?" The boy studied Ibrahim's face with those ancient eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of bitter experience and hard-won wisdom that cut straight to Ibrahim's soul. "Many people have said they want to help children like us," Amadou said with devastating honesty. "They make promises with tears in their eyes and conviction in their voices. They talk about how wrong it is for children to live like this, how something must be done to change things." He paused, his gaze never wavering from Ibrahim's face. But when morning comes, when the sun rises and they return to their comfortable lives with full stomachs and warm beds, they forget about children like us. We become invisible again until the next time someone needs to feel good about themselves by making empty promises they never intend to keep. The simple, devastating truth of those words hit Ibrahim like a physical blow to his chest, leaving him momentarily speechless. The boy's cynicism was not the product of natural pessimism or a bad attitude developed in childhood. It was the result of betrayal after betrayal, of hope offered and then cruelly snatched away by adults who made promises they never intended to keep, who treated the suffering of children as an opportunity for temporary emotional satisfaction rather than a call to sustained action. Ibrahim thought about all the times he himself had walked past begging children on the streets during his patrols, all the occasions when he had dropped a few coins into an outstretched hand and then continued on with his day, his conscience temporarily satisfied by the small gesture, but his life fundamentally unchanged by the encounter. He remembered all the times he had told himself that one person could not possibly make a real difference in the face of such overwhelming poverty and injustice. All the moments when he had convinced himself that the problems were too big, too complex, too deeply rooted for individual action to matter in any meaningful way. But looking directly into Amadou's eyes, seeing the evidence of how one small boy had already made all the difference in the world to 3 abandoned babies, Ibrahim knew with absolute certainty that excuses were no longer acceptable. If a 7-year-old child could take responsibility for 3 lives and succeed against impossible odds, then a grown man with resources, training, and authority had no right to claim helplessness or hide behind the comfortable fiction that individual actions don't matter. "I give you my word, Amadou," Ibrahim said with quiet intensity, meeting the boy's gaze directly and speaking with all the conviction he could summon. "I swear on my honor as a soldier, as a man, and as a citizen of this country that I will not forget you or your sisters. I will not abandon you when the novelty wears off or when helping becomes inconvenient. I will not make promises I cannot keep." He leaned closer, his voice growing stronger with each word. "This is not about making myself feel better or satisfying my conscience with temporary charity. This is about making things right. This is about ensuring that no child in our country has to choose between eating and feeding their siblings. This is about building a system that protects the innocent instead of preying upon them. What happened next would change not just the lives of 4 forgotten children living in a metal shack, but the entire course of Burkina Faso's history and Ibrahim's own destiny. Because Ibrahim Traoré was discovering that he was a man who kept his promises no matter what the personal cost might be. And this particular promise would drive him to challenge the corruption and injustice that had created children like Amadou in the first place. The very next morning, Ibrahim began what would become the most important investigation of his life. He started by quietly documenting everything he could about the children's situation and the circumstances that had led to their abandonment by every institution that should have protected them. Working carefully to avoid arousing suspicion from his superiors, Ibrahim interviewed neighbors in the slum who remembered the children's arrival 2 years earlier. He tracked down distant relatives who had been unable or unwilling to take in 4 additional mouths to feed. He spoke with officials at aid organizations, government agencies, and international relief programs, building a comprehensive picture of how 4 innocent children could fall through every crack in what was supposed to be a social safety net. What he discovered during those weeks of investigation made his blood boil with righteous fury that grew stronger with each new piece of evidence he uncovered. The aid money meant to feed families like Amadou's had been systematically stolen by government officials at every level of the bureaucracy. International food supplies donated by wealthy countries and charitable organizations had been diverted to private warehouses and sold on the black market for personal profit. Programs designed to help orphaned children existed only on paper, their budgets disappearing into the bank accounts of corrupt administrators who had never seen a hungry child in their lives and would not recognize genuine need if it appeared at their front doors. The entire system was rotten from top to bottom, designed not to serve the people but to enrich those in positions of power and authority. Ibrahim's investigation led him higher and higher up the chain of command, revealing a network of corruption so extensive and so brazen that it took his breath away. Officials who should have been protecting the most vulnerable citizens were instead preying upon them with systematic cruelty, growing wealthy on the suffering of children, like Amadou, while maintaining public facades of concerned leadership and moral authority. The president himself lived in a palace that cost more to maintain for a single month than it would take to feed every hungry child in the capital for an entire year. Government ministers sent their children to expensive private schools in Europe, while public schools in their own country lacked basic supplies like textbooks, desks, and functioning toilets. As Ibrahim gathered evidence and built his case with methodical precision, he also worked tirelessly to transform the lives of the 4 children who had started this journey. He arranged for medical care to address the malnutrition and health problems that years of neglect had created. He provided proper nutrition, watching with joy as the children's hollow cheeks began to fill out and their eyes regained the brightness that hunger had stolen. He found them safe housing in a modest but comfortable home where they could sleep without fear and play without constant vigilance for danger. Most importantly, he watched Amadou slowly begin to trust that this adult would not betray him like so many others had done before. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The boy began to smile more often, to laugh with his sisters, to act like the child he should have been allowed to be all along. But as the weeks passed, Ibrahim came to a painful realization. Helping 4 children, while incredibly important and personally fulfilling, was not nearly enough to address the scope of the problem he had uncovered. For every Amadou he saved, there were hundreds of other children facing the same impossible circumstances throughout the country. The problem was not individual tragedy or isolated cases of unfortunate circumstances. It was systematic failure on a massive scale, and systematic failures required systematic solutions that went far beyond charity or individual acts of kindness. The evidence Ibrahim had, gathered during his investigation, pointed inexorably to corruption at the highest levels of government. Officials who had sworn oaths to serve the people were instead serving themselves with shameless greed, and the cost was being paid in the lives and futures of innocent children who had never harmed anyone. Ibrahim found himself facing a choice that would define not just his own future but potentially the future of his entire nation. He could submit his evidence through proper channels and hope that the same corrupt system would somehow find the conscience and courage to reform itself. He could trust that officials who had been stealing from children for years would suddenly develop moral authority and begin serving the public good. Or he could take much more dramatic action that would require every ounce of courage he possessed, and might cost him everything he had worked for in his military career, including quite possibly his life. Corrupt officials, as Ibrahim well knew, did not hesitate to eliminate threats to their profitable schemes. They had the resources, the connections, and the ruthless willingness to make problems disappear permanently. Previous attempts at reform had been met with mysterious accidents, sudden illnesses, and unexplained disappearances that served as warnings to anyone who might consider following similar paths. For weeks, Ibrahim agonized over the decision that he knew would change everything. He spent sleepless nights considering the risks, the potential consequences, and the possibility that his actions might make things worse rather than better. He thought about his own family, his career, his future, and all the things he might lose if he chose to challenge the most powerful people in the country. But every time doubt crept into his mind, every time he wondered if the risk was too great or the odds of success too small, he thought about Amadou carefully dividing that single piece of stale bread among his sisters. He remembered the dignity in that small boy's eyes, the love and sacrifice displayed without hesitation or complaint, the courage that had kept 4 children alive when every institution designed to protect them had failed. If a 7-year-old child could show such extraordinary courage in the face of impossible odds, then grown men with training, weapons, and institutional support had no excuse for cowardice. If Amadou could take responsibility for 3 lives and succeed against overwhelming challenges, then Ibrahim could find the courage to take responsibility for his entire country. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice than like an inevitable conclusion to everything that had come before. Ibrahim began reaching out carefully and discreetly to other military officers who shared his frustration with the corruption they witnessed daily in their service to the country. What he discovered surprised and encouraged him. He was not alone in his outrage or his desire for change. Many of his fellow soldiers had been waiting for someone brave enough to take the first step toward real reform. Someone willing to risk everything for the chance to build a better future for their country and their children. The planning took months of careful preparation, conducted in absolute secrecy. Ibrahim and his growing circle of allies knew that they would have only one chance to succeed, and failure would mean not just the end of their careers, but quite possibly the end of their lives. Every detail had to be perfect, every contingency planned for, every potential weakness identified and addressed. They studied the schedules and habits of key government officials. They identified which military units could be trusted and which were too deeply compromised by corruption to be reliable. They planned communication strategies, logistical requirements, and contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine. But perhaps most importantly, they prepared their message to the people of Burkina Faso. This was not going to be just another military coup driven by personal ambition or tribal politics. This was going to be a revolution driven by evidence, by moral clarity, and by a vision of what their country could become if it actually served its citizens instead of exploiting them. The day of action arrived like thunder following lightning. Sudden, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. Ibrahim and his carefully chosen team of reform-minded military officers moved with the precision and coordination that months of planning had made possible. In the early hours of the morning, before the sun had fully risen over Ouagadougou, they took control of key government facilities throughout the capital. The presidential palace, the national treasury, the state radio and television stations, and the major military bases all came under the control of Ibrahim's forces with minimal resistance and no loss of life. The corrupt president and his inner circle of collaborators found themselves facing the justice they had avoided for so long. The ministers who had grown wealthy selling food meant for starving children were arrested in their luxurious homes. The officials who had diverted aid money to their private accounts were taken into custody along with the evidence of their crimes. Ibrahim addressed the nation on radio and television, speaking directly to the people of Burkina Faso in clear, simple language that everyone could understand. He explained the evidence of systematic corruption that his investigation had uncovered, showing documents and bank records that proved beyond any doubt how their leaders had betrayed their trust. He spoke about children like Amadou, about families destroyed by officials who had stolen their food and their hope. He talked about the network of theft and betrayal that had turned what should have been a prosperous nation into a place where children fought for scraps while their leaders lived like kings. But most importantly, Ibrahim outlined his vision for a new Burkina Faso, a country where government served the people instead of preying upon them, where aid money actually reached the families it was meant to help, where children could go to school instead of searching for food in garbage piles. The international community watched nervously as yet another African nation experienced military intervention, with diplomats and foreign governments issuing the usual statements about the importance of democratic processes and civilian rule. But Ibrahim's actions spoke louder than diplomatic concerns or international criticism. He immediately began implementing concrete programs to address the most urgent needs of his people. Food distribution centers were established in every neighborhood, staffed by honest officials under direct military supervision to ensure that supplies actually reached hungry families. Medical clinics were opened and staffed, with doctors and nurses who had been trained but unemployed because there had been no money left in health budgets after. Corruption took its toll. Schools that had been closed for lack of funds were reopened with new supplies, and teachers whose salaries were guaranteed by the new government. Infrastructure projects that had existed only on paper, while their budgets disappeared into private. Accounts were actually begun with proper oversight and accountability measures. Ibrahim proved through concrete actions, not just words, that his revolution was about public service rather than personal power. He moved out of the presidential palace and into a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. He reduced government salaries, starting with his own, and redirected the savings into programs for education, healthcare, and child welfare. 6 months after that life-changing encounter in the marketplace, Ibrahim stood in the garden of the modest but comfortable home where Amadou and his sisters now lived. The house was not a mansion or palace, but it was filled with something far more valuable than luxury. It was filled with the laughter and joy of children who no longer had to worry about where their next meal would come from or whether they would have a safe place to sleep at night. Amadou was teaching his youngest sister to walk, his patient voice encouraging her every stumbling step across the soft grass. The child who had once divided stale breadcrumbs with mathematical precision now watched over a sister who was healthy and strong, whose eyes were bright with the security of knowing she was loved, protected, and cared for by people who would never abandon her. The other children played nearby under the shade of a mango tree, their bodies finally filled with proper nutrition. their minds free to focus on games and learning and all the normal concerns of childhood instead of the desperate mathematics of survival. They attended school now, learning to read and write and dream about futures that extended beyond the next meal or the next safe place to sleep. But Ibrahim's work was far from finished. The corruption he had uncovered while investigating the children's situation had opened his eyes to problems that extended far beyond stolen aid money or neglected social programs. Burkina Faso faced challenges that would require years of dedicated effort to overcome, problems that could not be solved by one person or one government action, no matter how well-intentioned. The new administration had to rebuild trust between the government and citizens who had been betrayed so often that cynicism had become a survival mechanism. They had to create new institutions and systems of accountability that would prevent future corruption, while addressing the immediate needs of people who had been ignored for too long. Ibrahim had documented everything he discovered during his investigation with the thoroughness of a prosecutor, building a case for the International Criminal Court. He had built comprehensive legal cases that reached to every level of the old government, ensuring that the officials who had stolen from children would face real consequences for their actions, rather than the comfortable exile or house arrest that had been their punishment in previous decades. More importantly, Ibrahim began the long, difficult process of rebuilding the relationship between government and citizens that corruption had poisoned. He implemented transparency measures that made it impossible for officials to divert aid money without immediate detection and public exposure. Every government contract, every budget allocation, every expenditure over a modest threshold was published online for public scrutiny. He created oversight committees that included ordinary citizens alongside government representatives, giving people direct power to monitor the officials who served them. He opened the books, the warehouses, and the bank accounts to public inspection, proving through actions rather than words that the new administration existed to serve the people rather than exploit them. The changes were not just administrative or procedural, they were deeply personal and cultural. For the first time in generations, government officials found themselves living in the same communities as the people they served, shopping in the same markets, sending their children to the same schools. The artificial separation between rulers and ruled that had made corruption possible was systematically dismantled and replaced with genuine accountability as Ibrahim watched Amadou swing his youngest sister around in the garden, both children laughing with pure joy and innocent happiness that had been impossible during their years of struggle. He reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them all to this moment of hope and possibility. It had all started with one small boy who refused to give up despite impossible odds. A child who carried burdens that would have broken many adults, but never lost his capacity for love, sacrifice, and determination. That boy had taught Ibrahim lessons about leadership that no military academy could provide and no textbook could adequately explain. From Amadou, Ibrahim learned that true leadership was not about power, position, or the ability to give orders that must be obeyed without question. True leadership was about service, about protecting those who could not protect themselves, about making personal sacrifices so that others could have better lives, about taking responsibility for outcomes rather than just intentions. He learned that courage often came in the smallest packages, and that the most profound acts of heroism were often performed by people who had no choice but to be heroes. Amadou had never asked to become the sole protector of 3 babies, but when circumstances demanded it, he had risen to meet the challenge with a grace and determination that humbled grown men. Ibrahim also learned that love was indeed the most powerful force for change in the world, capable of motivating actions that fear, anger, or ambition could never inspire. The love that drove Amadou to divide his food, to carry babies through dangerous streets, to face potential violence and certain hunger, for the sake of his sisters. That same love could drive a nation to transformation if it was channeled properly and protected from those who would exploit it for personal gain. But, perhaps most importantly, Ibrahim learned that every person has the potential to be a catalyst for change if they are willing to see suffering and respond with action rather than sympathy. The difference between a world where children starve while officials feast and a world where every child has enough to eat is not resources or technology or international aid. It is the willingness of individuals to take responsibility for outcomes beyond their immediate self-interest. Today, Ibrahim Traoré was known around the world as the young captain who stood up to corruption and changed his country's destiny through a single courageous action. International media described him as a reformer and revolutionary, a military leader who chose justice over job security and public service over personal advancement. Foreign diplomats studied his methods. Academics wrote papers about his approach to governance, and other nations sent delegations to learn how Burkina Faso had managed to transform itself from a symbol of African corruption into a model of transparent, accountable government that actually served its people. But Ibrahim would always remember that his greatest teacher had been a 7-year-old boy named Amadou, who had shown him that courage came in the smallest packages, and that love was the most powerful force for change in the world. Every policy he implemented, every reform he championed, every decision he made as a leader was guided by the memory of that small boy dividing breadcrumbs, with the precision of love and the determination of someone who understood that every life was precious and worth fighting for. The transformation of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim's leadership became more than just a national success story. It became a beacon of hope for oppressed people throughout Africa and beyond. The demonstration that systematic corruption could be defeated, that governments could actually serve their citizens, and that military intervention could lead to genuine reform rather than just another cycle of exploitation-inspired movements in neighboring countries. Young officers in Mali, Niger, and other West African nations began asking themselves the same questions that had driven Ibrahim to action. How can we serve in militaries that protect corrupt officials instead of innocent citizens? How can we take oaths to defend our countries when our governments are the primary threat to our people's welfare? The Amadou effect, as international observers began calling it, spread far beyond military circles. Teachers who had watched educational budgets disappear into private pockets began demanding transparency and accountability. Doctors and nurses who had seen medical supplies diverted from hospitals to black markets, organized to ensure that healthcare actually reached the patients who needed it. Ordinary citizens who had accepted corruption as an unchangeable fact of African life began to believe that their voices mattered, that their demands for honest government could be heard and acted upon. The cynicism that had protected people from disappointment began to give way to hope and active engagement in the political process. Ibrahim established the Amadou Foundation, named after the boy whose courage had started everything, dedicated to identifying and supporting children who were falling through the cracks of society. The foundation operated on a simple principle: every child's life had infinite value, and no child should be abandoned to survive alone in a world that seemed designed to destroy them. But the foundation did more than provide charity. It worked to identify and address the systemic problems that created abandoned children in the first place. Teams of investigators worked to track missing aid money, to expose officials who were diverting resources meant for families, and to ensure that social safety nets actually caught the people who fell rather than allowing them to slip through bureaucratic gaps. The success of these efforts was measured not in statistics or budget reports, but in the faces of children who were learning to trust adults again, who were discovering that the world could be a safe and nurturing place rather than a constant threat to their survival. 2 years after the revolution, Ibrahim found himself addressing the United Nations General Assembly in New York, speaking to world leaders about the lessons Burkina Faso had learned in its transformation from a symbol of corruption to a model of transparent governance. "The greatest teacher I ever had," he told the assembled delegates, "was a 7-year-old boy who showed me that love is stronger than fear, that courage comes in the smallest packages, and that individual actions can change the destiny of entire nations." He spoke about Amadou not as a symbol or metaphor, but as a real child whose sacrifice and determination had exposed a network of corruption that reached to the highest levels of government. He challenged other leaders to look for the Amadous in their own countries, the children whose suffering revealed the failures of systems that claimed to protect them. The speech was broadcast around the world and translated into dozens of languages. But Ibrahim knew that words alone were not enough. Real change required concrete actions, sustained commitment, and the willingness to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable over the comfort of the most powerful. Back home in Burkina Faso, the challenges of transformation continued. Old patterns of corruption died hard, and there were constant attempts by former officials and their international collaborators to undermine the new systems of transparency and accountability. Criminal networks that had profited from stolen aid money did not simply accept their losses and move on to other activities. They fought back through sabotage, bribery, and violence. Several officials who had been instrumental in establishing the new oversight mechanisms were threatened, attacked, or forced to flee the country for their safety. International corporations and foreign governments that had benefited from corrupt relationships with the previous administration also pushed back against the reforms. They lobbied their own governments to pressure Burkina Faso to return to the stability of the previous system, where contracts could be obtained through bribes rather than competitive bidding, and where environmental and labor standards could be ignored in exchange for political donations. But Ibrahim had learned from Amadou that persistence in the face of overwhelming challenges was the only path to meaningful change. Every setback was met with renewed determination. Every attack on the new systems was answered with stronger protections and wider public support. 5 years after their first meeting in the slums of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim stood with Amadou at the graduation ceremony of the first class from the National Academy of Public Service, a school established to train a new generation of government officials who understood that their role was to serve citizens rather than exploit them. Amadou, now 12 years old, was not yet a student at the academy, but he had been involved in designing its curriculum and training programs. His experiences as a child trying to navigate government bureaucracies that were designed to exclude and discourage the poor had provided invaluable insights into how services should actually work. Every official should spend a week living like I lived, Amadou had told the curriculum committee with the seriousness of someone much older. They should know what it feels like to be hungry, to be ignored, to have doors slammed in their face by people who are supposed to help. Then maybe they would understand why their job matters. The boy's sisters had also thrived in the years since their rescue from the streets. The youngest, who had been barely alive when Ibrahim first saw her, was now a healthy, energetic child who loved school and dreamed of becoming a doctor so she could help other sick children. The middle sister had discovered a talent for mathematics and spent hours working on problems that challenged students much older than herself. But it was Amadou himself who had undergone the most remarkable transformation. The premature seriousness that had made him seem far older than his years had gradually given way to a more natural childhood, though he retained the wisdom and empathy that his early experiences had developed. He had become something of a celebrity, not just in Burkina Faso but internationally, as his story spread and inspired others. But he handled the attention with the same dignity he had shown during his darkest moments, using his platform to speak for children who were still struggling rather than to promote himself. "I was lucky," he would tell reporters and documentary filmmakers who wanted to focus on his individual story. "Captain Traoré found me and helped me. But there are millions of children like I was, and they need people to find them too. The story is not about me, it's about what happens when adults decide to see children and protect them, instead of ignoring them." Ibrahim had ensured that Amadou and his sisters received the best education available. But he had been careful not to isolate them from the realities of life in Burkina Faso or to create an artificial bubble of privilege around them. They lived in the same middle-class neighborhood as many other families, attended public schools that served all economic classes, and remained connected to the community where their transformation had begun. As Ibrahim reflected on the journey that had begun with a hungry child in a marketplace, he recognized that the true measure of success was not in the international recognition or the economic indicators that showed Burkina Faso's improvement. The real success was in the generation of children who were growing up with the expectation that their government would serve them rather than exploit them. children who had never known. Hunger could not imagine that aid. Money meant to feed them might be stolen by officials. Students who attended well-equipped schools with dedicated teachers found it difficult to believe that education budgets had once disappeared into private accounts. Young people who received medical care when they were sick had never experienced a world where medicines donated for their treatment were sold on black markets. This generation would grow up with different expectations and different standards for their leaders. They would not accept corruption as normal or inevitable because they had never lived in a world where it was tolerated. They would demand transparency because they had grown up with it, expect accountability because they had experienced it, and insist on service because they had received it. But Ibrahim also understood that maintaining these changes would require constant vigilance and continuous effort. Every generation would have to choose again whether to protect the systems that serve the vulnerable or to allow them to decay back into instruments of exploitation. The lesson that Amadou had taught that individual actions matter, that one person's courage can change everything, that love is stronger than fear, would have to be learned again by each new generation of leaders and citizens. Ibrahim established annual Amadou Days throughout Burkina Faso, when schools and communities would focus on identifying children who might be falling through cracks in the social safety net and on celebrating the adults who took responsibility for protecting them. These were not charity drives or feel-good events, but serious efforts to ensure that no child would ever again have to survive alone as Amadou had done. The days became opportunities for citizens to examine their own communities, to ask difficult questions about why some children thrived while others struggled, and to take concrete actions to address the problems they discovered. Government officials were required to participate not as observers, but as active investigators, getting out of their offices and into the streets to see firsthand how their policies affected real families. The story that had begun with one small boy protecting his sisters in the slums of Ouagadougou had become a universal message about the power of individual action to create systemic change. Ibrahim's experience proved that ordinary people who were willing to see suffering and respond with courage rather than indifference could transform entire nations. But the lesson extended far beyond Burkina Faso or even Africa. In every country, in every community, there were children like Amadou, young people who were falling through cracks in systems that claimed to protect them, who were surviving through their own courage and determination, while adults who should have been helping them instead looked away. In wealthy nations, these children might be homeless youth aging out of foster care, immigrant children separated from their families, or teenagers struggling with mental health issues that their schools and healthcare systems were not equipped to address. In developing countries, they might be child soldiers, trafficking victims, or simply children whose families had been destroyed by war, poverty, or disease. But regardless of the specific circumstances, the fundamental challenge was the same. Would adults with power and resources take responsibility for protecting the vulnerable, or would they allow systems of exploitation and neglect to continue? Ibrahim began speaking at international conferences not just about corruption and governance, but about the moral imperative for individual action in the face of systematic injustice. He challenged audiences to identify their own Amadous, the people in their communities whose suffering revealed failures in systems that claim to serve and protect. The test of any society, he would tell these audiences, is not how it treats its most powerful members, but how it treats its most vulnerable. Every policy, every institution, every leader should be judged by this standard. Does it protect children like Amadou, or does it abandon them? He reminded listeners that systemic change always began with individual decisions, the choice to see rather than look away, to act rather than hope someone else would take responsibility, to persist rather than give up when the challenges seemed overwhelming. Amadou taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, Ibrahim would say. Courage is taking action to protect others despite your fear, despite the risks, despite the possibility of failure. Every person who has ever made a difference in the world has had to make that choice between courage and comfort, between action and apathy. Today, Ibrahim Traoré continues to lead Burkina Faso with the same principles that guided his decision to follow a hungry child through the marketplace years earlier. Every policy proposal is evaluated through the lens of how it will affect the most vulnerable citizens. Every budget allocation is scrutinized to ensure that resources actually reach the people they are meant to serve. The country has become a destination for delegations from other African nations seeking to learn how to combat corruption and build transparent governance. Universities send students to study the Burkina Faso model of citizen engagement and accountability. International organizations use the country's transformation as a case study in how military intervention can lead to genuine democratic reform rather than just another cycle of authoritarian rule. But Ibrahim knows that the most important measures of success are not found in academic studies or diplomatic praise. They are found in the faces of children like Amadou's sisters, who are growing up healthy and educated and full of hope for their futures. They are found in the communities where parents no longer have to choose between feeding their children and sending them to school because both food and education are available and accessible. Amadou himself, now a teenager, has become a powerful advocate for child welfare throughout West Africa. He speaks at conferences and appears in documentaries. But his most important work happens in the communities, where he identifies children who are struggling and connects them with adults who can help. Has never forgotten the lessons of his early childhood, the importance of protecting those who are more vulnerable, the power of love to overcome impossible obstacles, the necessity of persistence in the face of overwhelming challenges. But he has also learned new lessons about hope, about the possibility of change, and about the capacity of human society to evolve toward greater justice and compassion. I want every child to know what I know now, he tells the young people he mentors. I want them to understand that they matter, that their lives have value, that there are adults who will fight for them and protect them. But I also want them to know that they have power, the power to help others, to make a difference, to change things for the better. The foundation that bears his name has expanded beyond Burkina Faso, working in countries throughout Africa and beyond to identify and support children who are surviving without adequate protection or support. But its mission remains simple and focused. Ensure that no child has to face the world alone, as Amadou once did. The lesson that Amadou taught Ibrahim is one that every person on earth needs to remember and apply in their own lives and communities. In a world full of injustice and suffering, in a world where corruption and selfishness often seem to triumph over decency and compassion, it is easy to feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problems we face. It is tempting to believe that one person cannot make a real difference, that individual actions are meaningless in the face of systematic failures and institutional corruption. It is comfortable to assume that someone else will take responsibility, that the problems are too big or too complex for ordinary people to address. But every great change in human history started with one person who decided that the status quo was not acceptable. Every revolution, every reform, every step forward for humanity began with someone who said no to the way things were and yes to the way things should be. Every advancement in justice, every expansion of human rights, every victory over oppression started with individuals who chose action instead of apathy, courage instead of comfort. The civil rights movement began with individuals like Rosa Parks, who refused to accept injustice as normal. The abolition of slavery started with people who recognized that human bondage was morally wrong, regardless of its economic benefits. The struggle for women's rights began with individuals who rejected the idea that gender should determine human worth or opportunity. In each case, the change began not with governments or institutions, but with ordinary people who decided to take extraordinary action in defense of those who were suffering or oppressed. What will you do when you encounter your own Amadou? When you come face to face with injustice and suffering that demands action rather than sympathy? When you discover that systems designed to protect the vulnerable are instead preying upon them? When you realize that children in your own community are falling through cracks that could be repaired if enough people cared enough to act? Will you walk past and hope someone else takes responsibility? Will you make excuses about how the problems are too big or too complex for one person to address? Will you convince yourself that your individual actions don't matter in the face of systematic failures? Or will you follow Ibrahim's example and let your conscience guide you toward courage rather than comfort? Will you choose to see rather than look away, to act rather than hope, to persist rather than give up when the challenges seem overwhelming? Because somewhere in your community, in your city, in your nation, there is a child who needs someone to see them, to believe in them, to fight for them. There is an Amadou waiting for someone with the courage to say that their suffering matters more than your convenience, that their future is worth more than your security, that their life deserves the same protection and opportunity that you want for your own children. The choice is yours, and yours alone. The time is now, not tomorrow or next week or when conditions are more favorable, but right now, in this moment. You have the power to decide whether you will be part of the solution or part of the silence that allows injustice to continue unchallenged. What will you choose? What will your legacy be? Will you be remembered as someone who saw suffering and looked away, or as someone who saw suffering and decided to act? The children are waiting. The Amadis of the world are counting on adults with courage, compassion, and commitment to protect them and fight for their futures. The question is not whether you have the power to make a difference. You do. The question is whether you will choose to use that power on behalf of those who need it most. In the end, that choice, the choice between action and apathy, between courage and comfort, between seeing and looking away, is the choice that defines not just individual character, but the character of entire societies and civilizations. Ibrahim Traoré made his choice when he decided to follow a hungry child through the marketplace. Amadou made his choice when he decided to protect his sisters no matter what the cost to himself. Now it's your turn to choose. The future is waiting for your decision. This is the story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a story that began with compassion and ended with a revolution that transformed an entire nation. But more than that, it is a story about the power that every individual possesses to create change, to protect the vulnerable, and to build a more just and compassionate world. It is a reminder that heroes are not born with special powers or chosen by destiny. They are ordinary people who make extraordinary choices when confronted with injustice and suffering. They are individuals who decide that someone else's pain matters more than their own comfort, that protecting the innocent is worth any personal risk or sacrifice. The story continues today in Burkina Faso, where children who might have been abandoned to the streets are instead growing up with hope and opportunity. It continues in communities around the world where people inspired by Ibrahim's example are choosing to see the suffering around them and take action to address it. And it will continue with you. When you make your own choice about how to respond to the Amadis in your own community, the children and vulnerable people who need someone to see them, protect them, and fight for their right to live with dignity and hope. The question is not whether you will encounter injustice and suffering. You will. The question is what you will do when that moment comes. Will you choose courage or comfort? Action or apathy? Hope or helplessness? The children are waiting for your answer. Remember to like and subscribe for more stories of courage, transformation, and the power of individual action to change the world. Share this story with others who might need to hear it, and let us know in the comments how you plan to make a difference in your own community. Together, we can ensure that no child has to survive alone, that no suffering goes unseen, and that every person has the opportunity to live with dignity, hope, and the protection they deserve. The revolution begins with you.